Hi, this is Miss Michael, and I'm going to go over what gene flow is and how gene flow affects populations. Okay, we have a short video on gene flow that is simplified, and I'm going to pause the video intermittently and discuss gene flow and speciation.
In biology and the world you're living in, gene flow is an important concept about the transfer of genes between different individuals in a species. Genes are the little pieces of DNA inside each and every one of you that makes you, you. They are the reason why you look and act differently than your best friends, and are similar, but not quite the same as your siblings. Because different individuals have different sets of genes. Animals are the same way. Birds, for instance, may have slightly different colored feathers or be different sizes, but ultimately are the same species of bird. Even when a baby bird hatches, it will have its own unique mix of traits from its mom and dad, making it slightly different individually, but will still be the same species as its parents and the rest of the population. Across many, many generations, birds of the same species will continue to mix with each other and keep the population diverse. But what if something happens to split the bird population in half and keep them from sharing genes? One famous scientist named Charles Darwin studied this question over 100 years ago when he visited a group of islands in South America. A long time ago, one species of finch migrated from the mainland and settled in the islands. Some of the islands had small seeds for food, and the other islands had big seeds. Before migrating, the birds had all shared genes, and new generations of birds looked very similar to their ancestors. But after migrating, the birds each stayed on their own island and didn't mix with the birds on other islands, so the ocean became a natural barrier for the populations. After many years of separation, Darwin saw that the birds on the islands with big seeds had big beaks, and the birds on the islands with small seeds had small beaks. This study is extremely important in biology because it proves that when individuals are separated by a barrier and physically unable to mix their genes, eventually they will diverge into completely different species.
Okay, this is an example of speciation. It's also an example of a specific type of speciation. If you look at all of the different species of birds, it has this mainland finch has diverged into many different species. So that type of speciation is called adaptive radiation. Now, they mentioned gene flow in the beginning. Gene flow is when populations of organisms are interbreeding and sharing variations of traits and providing a mechanism for evolution. When there is no gene flow, as in Darwin's finches, you have a situation where the organisms are going to diverge into different species. When a new species is created, that is speciation. When multiple species form from a ancestral species, this is called adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation is a type of speciation.
Completely different species. When a population stays together, gene flow can happen and keep the species homogeneous. But when the population is separated, gene flow stops and creates two new species over time. Without gene flow, individuals in a species might eventually become so different that they can no longer reproduce with each other, and the population might even go extinct. And without gene flow, even humans wouldn't all be the same species.
So let's recap. And I have posted notes on my e-class. Gene flow. Gene flow is a mechanism of evolution, and it allows genes to be transferred from one population to another. So when you have a situation with migrating migrating individuals. Um, this allows populations to interbreed, it introduces new variation, and it keeps the species intact. So, when migrating individuals interbreed with a new population, they contribute their genes to the gene pool of the local population. And this establishes gene flow. If we have lack of gene flow, if there is no gene flow, that results in a type of divergent evolution, and you have speciation occurring. So, speciation is when there is the formation of a new distinct species. That means these birds that Darwin had studied, they cannot interbreed and reproduce. When you have two different species, those two different species cannot create offspring. Speciation is the formation of a new distinct species. Adaptive radiation is when you have several new species diverging from one species. When there is a lack of gene flow, speciation or adaptive radiation can occur. Some examples of gene flow. Um, So, in the example of the finches, the major barrier that these finches had were bodies of water. You have geographical barriers that can prevent gene flow, like bodies of water, mountains, rivers, things of that nature. When it comes to the human population, we have cultural barriers like for example, there is a population of Amish in Pennsylvania. The Amish people have a certain way of life, and they typically are not going to marry and interbreed outside of their culture. There are many other cultures in the world that have this barrier that prevent gene flow from happening. And sometimes when a population is small enough and there is lack of gene flow, you can have negative mutations result from that. These are some examples of gene flow in our ecosystem. Um, Red-haired people, if red-haired people were to leave Scotland, the next generation there would likely have very few people with this trait. That involves migration. Blue eyed people from Sweden moving to a small town in Mexico where blue eyes is rare. Mating and having offspring would introduce the blue eyes and other variations to that gene pool. Here it mentions birds. Some birds with shorter beaks enter into a population of birds with much longer beaks. It results in the hatching of birds with in between size beaks and other variations. So those are some examples of gene flow. And again, things that prevent gene flow, barriers can be geographical or they can be cultural.